All right, so we're going to get started. Today's webinar is kind of fun. It's a topic that may not be of interest to a lot of people, but it's based on an article that I wrote on BCG that became extremely popular. It's gotten, tens of thousands of people reviewed it. So I wanted to do a webinar on it today to go over performance reviews and some information about how to kind of handle it when you don't get the kind of performance review you want. And also, if you're getting good performance reviews, like kind of how to approach that situation as well. I do have a webinar, some PowerPoints here that I'll go through. But to get started, I wanted to tell you some stories about my performance reviews and kind of how they made me feel and how I ended up reacting to them when I started practicing law. And for me, performance reviews were literally like one of the most terrifying things practicing law as a young attorney. And what's important to understand is even as an associate, you're going to get reviewed and you're going to get reviewed at different levels, but you're also going to get reviewed your entire career. Like partners get reviewed their entire career and they don't like it as well. So, like income partners get reviewed, the partners that are senior get reviewed, that even have business, everybody's always getting reviewed. And that can be scary. Different firms won't review you, but some firms will. And the firms that review you, it can be very, very scary. To get started, I wanted to tell you, a couple different types of firms. So you'll typically have, large, very institutional, well-organized firms are always going to do performance reviews. And smaller firms where they need a lot of work or your salary is not that high, or there's a lot of work for you to do, typically will not do performance reviews. They're just so busy. Things are very good. They want to keep people engaged. And so a lot of times they won't give performance reviews, but that's also very scary because you don't know if you're on the partnership track or kind of how, things are going for you. So I'll start off by, I want to tell you some stories of the performance reviews that I had when I was an attorney, and they weren't all good. And I want to tell you how I reacted to them and how you should react to them. And then I'll go through some of this PowerPoint information as well. And again, performance reviews are just terrifying. So my first job was working in the Justice Department after my first year of law school. And I started getting assignments to write things. And then when I would write them, I would give them to, typically it was like, a junior attorney to review, and they would mark them up and make all these corrections and have all these different things that they would, correct. And for me, it was like terrifying. Like I couldn't believe how this stuff was being marked up, and I didn't feel, like I was doing well. And I think that what happens, when you're in law school is you're never really taught how to write as an attorney. Like you may learn how to do appellate briefs and things, but you're not taught how to write. You're not taught how to do things in the way that law firms want or government offices want. So when you get in there, a lot of times you're not really prepared for what happens. And so I was in that first performance review, I was very scared, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the criticism, and I felt like I needed to avoid certain people that were critiquing my work. And then I took long assignments, where I was just kind of analyzing all this stuff because I didn't want to have to turn in work that might get criticized. And so I kind of went into a lot of detail of it. And that was my first kind of, that was not a formal performance review, but because my stuff was getting marked up so much, I thought that, that I was kind of in trouble. And I ended up leaving that particular job in the Justice Department sooner than I needed to. I could have worked the whole summer, but I didn't work the whole summer. I decided to leave early. It was an unpaid job, but at the same time, I decided I needed to leave early because I didn't like that kind of negative feedback that I was getting. Then one thing I would also say, anytime your work or anything is criticized and you're not doing well, one lesson I learned in law school, my first semester grades were, not as good as I wanted them to be. I felt like they would keep me out of, major US law firms for, possibly I wouldn't be able to get in there. And then my second semester, I just went all out. I did like everything I could. I studied all the time and got very good grades. And, the idea is that when your work is criticized in the legal profession, even if it's in law school, you need to like double down and just give everything you got. And so I did learn lessons when I was in the Justice Department about the importance of work. But then I got into my second summer, which was in a large New York law firm. And after 5 weeks, they came and they did performance reviews. And at that time, I thought that my work was okay. I was getting into work in the summer associate job like at 9 or 10 and leaving at like 5 or 6. And a lot of summer associates were doing that. And my first performance review, I went into this like dark room. And the room, I mean, it was very dark. You could hardly see people's faces. It was just very weird. And it was like wood panel room. And they started kind of like launching into me. And at the beginning of the review, they said, this stuff isn't definitive. It's not permanent. It doesn't mean you're not going to get an offer. And they started just being very critical of things that I'd done. Like someone asked me to look for cases. I turned in the cases and I didn't like research them well enough. And then she was mad at me. And a couple other things happened. I was working for a partner and I asked him a question and he said, I don't have fucking time for this right now. And stormed out and he didn't like my question. And I had been kind of working without anybody giving me any sort of feedback on my work. And so I got this horrible performance review. And other people said that they got really good performance reviews. And it turned out later that they hadn't. But people like other attorneys, when they're talking to other attorneys, I learned that they're very competitive and won't kind of show weakness to others. And that's what these other summer associates were doing. So I talked to a girl that had gone to law school with me, and she had a mentor that she knew from college or something, or I don't know how she knew her, but she was actually an associate in the law firm. And she said she said that associate told her that the most important thing that you need to do as a summer associate is just bill a lot of hours, because if they see that, they're going to like you. And so I got into my second, I got into my second half of my summer, which was like 6 or 7 weeks. Give me a second here. Close something. Just fix something here. That doesn't really matter. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I just don't want to make sure my computer doesn't crash. I have a computer. And anyway, so I got into the second half of my summer, and the lesson that she learned, which was like she had worked like crazy, like the first 5 or 6 weeks before a performance review. And the lesson that she learned was, and she was told, is you just need to bill a lot of hours. So my second half of the summer, I billed like 50 or 60 hours like every single week. I stayed late. I got in early. I worked, very hard. And the other thing that I did was I sought out people that I was comfortable with, that I liked, and I could bond, and I got work from them. And then I discussed things with them, went out to lunch if I could, and got very, very close to the people that I was doing work for, and really gave them a lot of work and did everything I could to provide the kind of work that they wanted, and ask questions. And then I also talked to senior associates and mid-level associates about what I should do. And then I went into my second summer of my second half, and I got my second half review. They were like, we're awesome. Like you did really well. Like we're going to make you an offer, to work. But, what practice area do you want? And I said, I want litigation or tax. And they kept saying, not corporate, not corporate. And I was like, no, I want to do litigation or tax. And my mistake then was that I didn't choose the practice area that they wanted to put me in. And my answer should have been, I want to do corporate. I want to do corporate because the firm had mainly corporate work. So I gave them that answer, and then I had a clerkship coming up, and they were kind of like, well, your offer is good right now, but you have a clerkship, and most of our openings are in corporate, not litigation. And so, and what I should have said to them was, I'll do any practice area that you need help in, and that would have gotten me much better, put me in a much better position to, be very solid and be able to come back there after my clerkship. So that was my second performance review. And I learned in that review that the most important thing for them was working really hard hours and bonding with the right people. And because I did that, my next performance review was good. So, the lesson there is you need to kind of find out what's most important in for the people that you're working for. And in this large New York firm, the most important thing for them was working a lot of hours, and I was strategic and worked for the people that I thought were, the best people to possibly work for. I got into, and I'm telling you these stories because I want you to understand kind of how performance reviews work and how to kind of, position yourself to do well. And so, in law school, I positioned myself to do well by working like crazy and learning from my mistakes. In my first performance review, when I was working in the Justice Department, I got scared because I just couldn't stand the criticism. I'd never seen, have my work criticized like that. I'd always thought that I was really smart and always got really good grades on papers. And then I walked into this legal environment and it just was completely different. It was like, no one wants to hear like all your theories and things like you're taught to do when you're doing kind of graduate level work in college and things. And no one wants to hear that. They want to hear work that's very straightforward and simple. Like, you're just reaching conclusions. You're not talking about all these theories, which no one wants to read. And that's a very important thing. And something that gets a lot of people in trouble is they kind of overanalyze things that they don't get to conclusions. And that happens a lot with people from places like Yale Law School, where they're taught to do that instead of just being very direct. So my next performance review was I got into a federal clerkship, and I got there and I started working for this judge. And initially I would turn in stuff and there might be two or three typos or something, and he would come and talk to me and was very nice about it. But I could tell that he was upset. And then I'd been there like maybe a month or 5 weeks, and I was doing these things called habeas corpus petitions, which are when a prisoner like files this brief trying to get out of prison, and almost like 99.9% of them are rejected. So I was reviewing these and for the judge, and then writing these orders saying, and they're very simple, they're just like a page, rejecting these habeas corpus petitions. And I got, I got to write. I was writing them. I was writing like 20 or 30 of them at one time, just pushing them out. And I mean, not in one time, but over a couple of days, I'd read them, and they were just gibberish, and reject them. And I was reading these, and for some reason, I don't know what happened. It was subconscious or something, but I granted one of these habeas corpus petitions. And thankfully, this judge was reviewing them, because by granting them, I was like letting someone out of prison or something, which is just crazy. And he took me into his office. He had two double doors. So there was like one double door, but there was one door that he would just kind of close as a matter of fact, but he had two doors that he would close if it was something very serious or he was talking to a very important person in his office. So he closed both doors. He sat me down and he showed me this document where I'd done this. And I could feel like this, extreme, anger coming out of him. Like he was like really, really upset. And it was just when someone's that angry, I can pick up that energy. And, it made me like, quiver. And he was very, very mad. And he said, you've made these typos on these other things. And so, I started realizing like how important it was to like very carefully like proof your work and make sure there were no errors and all this kind of stuff, because if you make these errors, it's not good, especially when you make an error like I made. And so I was pretty terrified of all this. I continued to write these opinions for him, but they were often very theoretical, which he didn't like so much, but it was okay. And I learned that working for this judge, that he the work that he produced, I started to learn a very important thing about being an attorney. And I want to make sure, I explain this to everyone, and it's very important. When you have work that has, regardless of whether it's a memo or it's a legal pleading or a corporate document, the judge, when he was producing work, he doesn't want people to question his analysis like coming to a legal conclusion. So the idea is that there's a lot of thought going on between in the background when you're doing any type of legal work, and then when you're putting everything down on paper, that those legal things have been well reasoned. And if you're making like typos and doing things and not formatting things correctly when you're turning in something, what it looks like is it looks like that, if your work product doesn't look perfect, your conclusions are probably not perfect either. Like your thinking might be is sloppy if you're making typos and things. So I got into, I started learning this, and I started, being, very, very careful with the work that I was doing. I learned that in order to do good work for him, I had to, make sure that everything I turned in was perfect and didn't have typos. And so I would spend a lot of time like reviewing my work and making sure it was perfect. And there was another co-clerk that clerked with me, and she did that very, very well. It just came instinctively to her. She'd gone to Princeton and George Mason Law School, which is a conservative law school. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. I had a funny experience happen to me when I was in law school. I was with a friend, and we were walking down the hall, and there was a meeting of law and graduate Republicans. And at this point in my scholastic career, I didn't really understand the difference between Republicans and Democrats. And so we walked into this meeting, and there was like probably like 100 people in this large classroom, and they were taking nominations for some position like the vice president of the law and graduate Republicans. And he nominated me to be funny. And I've always been like, back then I was a pretty good public speaker. And so I got up and I made this like 5 or 10 minute speech about what I would do, that I was, going to get things done, just kind of generalities, not necessarily about the political party. But anyway, so I ran against all these people and won. And so I had on my resume that I participated in, doing the administrative work for the next year. But anyway, so I won this, even though I wasn't really a Republican, didn't really understand anything, and won this position. So I had this on my resume, and I was working for a judge that had been appointed by George Bush. And so he assumed also that I was a Republican, and that was what he was looking for. The co-clerk had gone, was very conservative and gone to a conservative law school, and had conservative things on a resume. And he assumed that I was also a conservative based on what was on my resume, and hired me because of that reason. So, sometimes when you get hired, you're getting hired because people think that you identify with them. They think that, that you're like a Republican or a Democrat, or for social justice or not for social justice. And they're hiring you because they believe that you share their outlook with things. And so he had hired me based on believing that that's where I was from. So because I wanted to appease him and make him like me and do a good job, I started doing things like he would go up in the morning when he got in to get his mail. I started going to get his mail for him to save him time, because the mail would come in. The court was above a post office, if you can believe it. So he would get his mail first. I started getting his mail for him. I started, doing the best work I could for him, and really thought that I was doing well. I started, doing a very good job. Like when I would introduce him, when he would come to court, there were all these procedures you followed where you had to click a button when he could come out, and then, you would stand up, and I did a really good job with that. I made sure I had a loud voice and everything, and I did other things to make him like me. I would write memos about things that, instead of writing an opinion first, and really try to do a good job. So I got there, and I was doing much better work, and I was getting on his side with the work. And in the courthouse that I was in, because he was very conservative, there were people that didn't like him. So there was a stenographer that didn't like him, and she just was independent from the court. There were people in the courthouse that didn't like him, meaning people that were in administrative roles, that they were there regardless of their political party. And they didn't like him because they felt that his decisions were very right wing. They didn't like him because of different procedures that he'd have. Like he'd require that, women wear dresses that are beneath their knees and stuff, and that men would wear suits to court. And so the people that would show up would all be, typically there was a lot of people from Dow Chemical in that area, because that's where it was based. It was based Bay City, Michigan, which is it's near Bay City. It's in Midland, near Bay City, where the courthouse was. So he would have all these procedures. The people that show up would typically be, business people that were conservative, and so then he would get conservative verdicts, and so he was very conservative. He'd never had a criminal, that was tried there get off, and he most of the time large companies would win, and then people that filed personal injury type suits would generally always lose. And I learned that judges can kind of control how things happen in the courthouse based on the way they treat one counsel. Like they can keep interrupting like a plaintiff's attorney if they do certain things, like if they don't use the candidate's name and they say she, and then just all the or the person's name. And so the judges can really set the flow of terms of how people win and lose in the courthouse. Very interesting. And then do the same thing with with the people that are the people that are coming before the court. I mean, anyway, that they can kind of control what happens. They can control it with their opinions. They can control it with how they treat counsel. They can control it with all sorts of different ways. So I learned that this judge was able to, and it's the same thing that you're seeing now with Democratic judges, for example, trying to stop Trump's immigration orders and things like, so they're filing things with very left-wing judges. And so federal judges can really control things. And so I started learning that, and the people that were in these administrative roles in the courthouse that didn't like him started, being my friend. I don't know why. And they would complain about the judge. And I started going golfing with this woman. I mean, she was older but nice. That was the stenographer that really didn't like him. And so he started getting the sense that I didn't like him because of the things that he was doing. And people would talk to me, and I would kind of get on the side of all these Democratic people. So suddenly, I was being very democratic, and I started turning in decisions when I would write opinions, and I would have them that were coming out on the wrong side that he didn't like, and he would come back and correct me and make me write them, and then I would try to do the same thing with other things, and so he became basically thinking that I was against him. So that's a big mistake that people make, and most clerks learn how to do that, but I started basically not being on his side. And then when we would go out to lunch every day, I would try to advocate for this other side, which he didn't like. That's about the stupidest thing you can do when you're working for someone, because you have to basically give them what they want. And that person that's employing you always need to understand, is someone that has control over your future. They're giving you work to do. They're going to be giving you reviews, and they're going to be references in the future, and they're people that can help you if you do what they want. So you need to always be on the side of your employer, and if you're not on the side of your employer, then you're going to have issues with your reviews. So that's one of the things that all employers are looking for. They want people that are on their side, and if you're on their side, you're typically going to get good reviews. If you're not on their side, and you're not going to get good reviews. And so it's very important that you understand that. And so in every organization, whether you work for the government or you work for a law firm, and at the associate level, and then also at the partner level, and all sorts of things, there's always groups of people that are for the employer, and there's always groups of people that are against the employer, meaning they don't like the policies, they don't like the compensation, they don't like certain attorneys. They're just not like for the employer. And so every employer out there, what they're doing, they have to keep, in order to have a good functioning business, they have to get the people out that are against them and bring people in that they believe are for them. And so that's one of the things that law firms are doing when they're reviewing you, is they're looking, like that judge was doing, for people that are for them as opposed to people that are against them. And so you can see, if you're in a law firm, you can always see the people that are against the employer. And sometimes they're against the employer because they didn't like their work, or sometimes they're against their employer because they don't like policies. I mean, I've seen some of the craziest things. I saw one guy I went out to dinner once with my ex-wife and one of her candidates, and she'd placed this candidate at this big firm, I think Winston and Strawn in Los Angeles. And a year later, he was coming to her, and he was a very smart guy. He'd gone to University of Chicago Law School. And he was very upset and mad at his employer because the partners got to park in the parking garage and they were making the associates park like at a outdoor parking area right across the street. And because of that, he had become very angry with his employer and was looking for a job, which was just absolutely crazy. So he was, that was coming through and things he did and stuff. And because of that, he was looking for a job. So I mean, that's an example of someone that becomes against their employer. So in every employer you're working for, you need to see like what side are you on? Are you on the side of the people that like the employer and are treating the employer with respect and are treating the people there with respect? Or are you on the side of people that don't like the employer? And if you're on the side of the people that don't like the employer, they're going to see what my judge saw. He saw me associating with people that were against the employer. And because I was doing that, he knew that I was probably against him. And that was, a big mistake. Like I, associated with people that were against him. And then I started acting like I was against him as well. So it got worse. I kept spending a lot of time with these people that were against him. And, it was very interesting, what happened. So one day, one of the marshals came into my office and the marshals work for the judge. And so she came into my office and she's very smart. Like she was asking questions and things and very direct. I mean, she's like a police officer, and she, came into my office and started asking me these questions about if I liked him and all these sort of things and trying to, figure out like what side I was on. Very, very interesting. And I'm thinking that the judge might have asked her to do that. And that's what happens. Like, in law firms, people will do the same thing. They will try to figure out kind of what side you're on. If you're not on the side of the people you're working for, you're going to get bad performance reviews and you're probably not going to do very well there. So you have to be very careful about what you say, who you say it to. And if you start saying things that are negative about people you're working with or your employer, that can get back to people that have power over you. So you always need to be very neutral, like not taking sides. You need to come across as on the side of the employer, and you need to be seen as someone that they can trust. And that's one of the big mistakes that people make. They seem like they're not someone that can be trusted. If they're not someone that can be trusted, then they don't like them. And so all law firms are going through this procedure where they're kind of getting rid of people that are not on their side, and they're bringing in people that are, and they're keeping the people that are on their side, and then they're getting rid of the people that aren't. And so it almost doesn't matter the quality of work you do. If you're not on their side, then you're probably going to get bad performance reviews and pushed out. I had this candidate years ago, and she was at a major law firm, like a very big law firm in Palo Alto, like a huge US law firm. And one day she was kind of someone that, said negative things to friends and things and was kind of the bad side. And she was maybe 1 year into working there. And one day someone walked into her office and said, this isn't working out. We'd like, you're done. And she was astonished, but they just said this is a bad cultural fit. So bad cultural fit basically means that we don't like you, like you're against our culture. And so that's very important to, understand, just being on the side of your employer, looking like you're on the side of your employer. And by the way, one of the mistakes, and this is, a huge mistake that people make on their resumes, like you should not be, when you're trying to apply to a bunch of firms and get a job, you should not be listing political affiliations, even journals, like things, gender journal or whatever. You should not be listing things that would trigger people to think that you're a Democrat or Republican, because some firms may be very Republican. And maybe if you want to apply to them, you put Republican things on there. But putting like the Federalist Society on your resume and trying to get jobs in San Francisco is probably going to be impossible. So you just need to be thinking, like, what does my resume say? Does my resume say that I'm very for social justice? Does my resume say that I'm very pro-Trump? Because if you put those things on your resume, then it's going to trigger people thinking that you're on one side or the other. And so you need to be very careful on your resume of making sure that you're not putting anything on there that's going to make an employer think that you're either Democrat or Republican or for, something, something or another, and I frankly, think even sometimes putting a lot of pro bono stuff on your resume is bad. I mean, I've seen people at top New York law firms like have resumes that will talk about like the first two or three lines about all this pro bono work that they did, and then they'll have like one line about the corporate experience, which is absolutely crazy. And I had a guy like that he'd gone to Columbia Law School and was like a Harlan Fistone scholar, and he was unemployed and couldn't understand like why he wasn't getting interviews and his peers were. And basically he was saying that, pro bono work is a priority for me. And law firms, obviously, major law firms in New York and other cities, I mean, they want to see people that are dedicated to them and the work and maybe aren't prioritizing pro bono. I mean, you can do pro bono, but putting that on your resume is not going to necessarily impress an employer. So anyway, so I was there at this clerkship and I made friends with all these other people, and I started writing these opinions that he didn't like. And then one day I continually was more and more associating with those people and being more Democratic than Republican, and talking to my clerk saying I disagreed with these opinions and everything. And so one day I had written a memo. I wrote this like 30-page memo on some issue before giving him an opinion. And I didn't have to do that. I did that because I was, very, committed and just going over the top and trying to do the absolute best work possible, which is another thing. Like if you go out of your way to really try to do good work, that can benefit you. But it's not going to benefit you if the employer doesn't think you're on their side, because that's one of the most important things to remember for performance reviews. So I got into this, judge, and I wrote this memo, and he, before the day that happened, I turned a couple days before it happened, he had a jury verdict where some woman that was injured in a Costco had sued the employer, and ended up, it was his first plaintiff's verdict, that he got a plaintiff's verdict there was a plaintiff's verdict in his court, and he was very upset about it. He asked me to do, I don't know why he was upset about it. I hadn't sat in the trial, but all of the clerks and everything were very upset. The court reporter was upset about it, and people were upset about it because they felt like this was, something he shouldn't have done. Well, anyway, they weren't upset about it when the verdict came out, but they were upset about what happened. So after the verdict came out, he immediately came in my office and he said, and I guess because it was my case, he said, I want you to do a judgment notwithstanding the verdict, and here's the case that you should use. And the case wasn't really applicable. I think he'd just given it to me because he was very angry and found the first thing he could because he just didn't like what had happened. And he'd given me this case, and then I looked at the case and I came into his office and I'm like, doesn't make any sense. This case has nothing to do with this particular fact pattern and stuff. And he got very mad and he was like, go find, a case that works. And so I was just, going over this, thing. And I was like, this is impossible. Like how do you possibly, take away the verdict in this particular circumstance? So I went into his office maybe once or twice, and I said, this is very difficult. Like I don't really think you have any basis to get it done. And he said, well, get it done. So I figured out a way to do it that I didn't think would ever hold up on appeal, and ended up, giving him the opinion. And then, there were certain things that had happened there in that court that I didn't like. Like he had, some woman was caught with LSD at a Grateful Dead concert. It was just like one piece, but it was heavy on heavy cardboard. And because of that, and I don't know why it was a federal case, but because of that, she was considered like a dealer. And so he ended up sentencing her to prison. She was like a college student, and people over in the court were upset about that. So all these kind of things going on, and that he didn't like. And I'd also made another mistake with the published opinion. There was like a typo when we sent it to Lexus or whatever it was, CD. But anyway, so he and I butted heads, and this judge was not saying the verdict. He got the sense that I was against him. And so because of that, he was very angry. So, and he could hear me sometimes probably talking, to other people would call me in the courthouse and say like how awful this was. And I would agree with them. And he had this way where he could actually go in and he could listen to my conversations just by pressing a button on his phone, and I wouldn't know if he was doing that. And he was the kind of guy that probably did. So I'm sure he was doing that. And after I talked to these people, I could see him, he would stomp out of his office all angry. So I'll just tell you another thing. Like when you're in a law firm, you are being watched. Most law firms, especially organized law firms, they will often have screen recording software on your computer watching everything that you do. They'll certainly look at their tech people will look at the URLs you visit. The admin people in the computer room will read your emails often and show things to people that they don't, show things to partners and things. And they will often even record your calls. And so they have them. So then I was in the first law firm I was telling you about, the second law firm I was in the summer. One day I walked past an admin room and there was all these kind of, look like recording things. And I said to the admin guy, are you guys recording all of the conversations? He said, not yours, because you're a summer associate, which I thought was funny. So, law firms are watching you. They're watching the URLs you visit. So if you spend a lot of time and how long you're on there, if you spend a lot of time in above the law and things like that, where there's, gossip and things going on, they'll see that. I remember a partner at Boyd Schiller told me that, they watch the sites and stuff, or maybe, I don't know if they were watching them, but he said that, people that spend a lot of time in above the law never make partner and they never get good reviews or don't do the best work. I mean, it's maybe, I don't know why that was, but they look at the things you visit, they're monitoring it. And so, if you're doing things like against the firm, they can pick it up. When I was and I'll tell you about my review at the second law firm I worked at, but when I was at, the second law firm I worked at, one time I walked into the managing partner's office and he had a shredder and he was this big pile of papers and he was taking people's emails and reading them and shredding them. So law firms are watching you. They're watching to see whose side you're on, and they're watching to see if you say bad things about them or bad things about people there. And if they see that, then they will again assume you're on the side of people that don't like you. So I wrote this memo after this judgment, notwithstanding the verdict for the judge. And I went in, and there was all this tension because people knew I didn't like him, and the legal secretary knew I didn't like him, and there was a court person and that worked in his office knew I didn't like him. And so one day I saw them going back and forth into his office and, looking, very serious. And I could tell that they were probably talking about me. And so this happened a couple of times. And then he came and he said, do you have a minute? And walked up to me. And I went into his office and he closed both doors. And he said, he took this memo that I'd written, this 30-page memo that I didn't have to write. And he flipped to page 23, and he said, you made a mistake, it's like some grammatical or typo or something on this page. And it was a memo. I mean, it was like a long memo. And he said, this is just unacceptable. And, I want to talk about, I just want to talk about how things are working here and that kind of thing and come up with some next steps. And so I could tell at that point and there was other things going on too. There was I don't know, this court administrator that came in that would, been in charge of helping him fire someone. I mean, I kind of noticed that. And so I was just kind of getting terrified working there. And it was all because I was on the wrong side. And so he basically started saying things to me like he was going to fire me. And so I was like, this is just terrifying. And so I didn't want to get fired. And so I said, well, I'd like to resign. And he said, so you're saying you'd like to resign? And I said, yes. And so I ended up resigning from this clerkship. Now, keep in mind, at this point, I had told the firm I was going to go back to that a 2-year clerkship. I was in a clerkship, so I hadn't yet taken the bar. And this was happening in June. And so I didn't have the bar. I didn't have a job lined up. And it was June, and my clerkship is ending. And I was in a small town in Bay City, Michigan, and didn't have the bar and didn't, I was kind of in bad shape. And so I ended up getting fired from this clerkship job, and I had like maybe he gave me like 2 weeks or something. And I told my fiance at the time, and she was absolutely like terrified. She's like, this guy doesn't have a job. This isn't what I signed up for. And I was getting married like in August or something. And she actually like left me. I was like left in this small town without a job, without the bar, and wifeless or fiance-less at that point. And it was sad because I've been with her for like 3 years. And but she just felt like this guy, like this is not good. He's got no future. And I was going home like every day and complaining about him, complaining to my dad, complaining to her about him, and just was really, just feeling just like I didn't like the job. And I've been doing that prior to getting fired. Another weird thing happened, which I don't know, maybe I'm over exaggerating here, maybe I'm reading into this. But one day I was talking to my dad on a cordless phone in my house, and I noticed this guy in his car, like not too far from, I lived in this, basically like it was like a townhouse, but there were three other townhouses. But I noticed him outside my window with like this parabola, and, which I was just, could have been listening to my conversation. I have no idea. I mean, I highly doubt it. That's kind of a lot of paranoia, but I noticed that and I was like kind of freaked out too. I was like, maybe this guy's listening to my home conversations. And so I was, just really against him and got fired. And after getting fired, I'll just tell you, I mean, that was a devastating thing. And people, everyone, attorneys at some point in their career get fired. Now, I hadn't actually been fired, but I was going to get fired. So I resigned. And so it was really tough for me. And one of the reasons I became a legal recruiter was because of kind of everything that I learned after getting fired from that job. And I'll just tell you, because I think this is important to kind of cover some of the things that I did. Now, you may have gotten fired or get fired at some point, but I started, I learned, a lot about what I know about recruiting and placement from when that happened. So, the first week or two after my fiance left me and I was jobless, I started coming home and drinking beer, smoking cigarettes, even though I didn't smoke. And then I reached a point where I was like, I got to fix this. And so, I did a lot of things. I'll just tell you briefly what I did. I'm not going to, this is about performance reviews, but I just want to kind of give you some encouragement if you do get a bad performance review and get fired, and also how to get a job. I started like thinking like, I started like listening to, self-improvement things like, Tony Robbins. I ordered some tapes from him, and I started listening to those, and I kind of got very motivated. And I realized, I have to set goals, and I have to be persistent. And I read this book, Think and Grow Rich, and I was in bad shape. It's too late for the bar exam. I don't have a job, and then I started like, thinking about like, what do I need to do differently? Like, what have I learned? And so, I'll tell you briefly what I learned when I was clerking for the judge. He got hundreds of resumes that came in, and for the next year, because he would interview people each year, like I guess in the when did they interview them? I don't remember, in the fall or in the March. I don't remember, but all these people come in. I noticed that the best resumes were usually ones that didn't have a ton of detail, like they didn't go into all this stuff, and they would just be very clear and direct. And my resume before that would talk about in great detail this asphalt business that I was very proud of. It had like a paragraph about it. It would, talk about all these things that were unrelated to practicing law. So I realized that, I was going to be a commercial litigator. So everything on my resume needed to talk about that. Instead of talking about all the corporate work I'd done as a summer associate in New York, I focused just on the commercial litigation work I did, even though it was maybe 30%. So I eliminated everything from my resume to make it only focus on one practice area, which you should be doing. Most resumes, 80% of them are talking about all these different practice areas, or they might have had a job doing, corporate law in one firm and a little bit of litigation and then all litigation in the next one. But then they talk about corporate work and when people are just hiring a litigator. So your resume only needs to focus on one practice area. So I learned the importance of that and the importance of, when I would my resume just making it focused on one practice area. And then I learned, and I did that. I figured, I studied it. I spent, what I did is before I did any of that. I wrote down like every single thing that I could think of that I'd done wrong so far in my legal career. And you should too, if you're, if you're worried about your performance reviews and things. I wrote down pages and pages, like, what I'd done wrong when I was interviewing. I didn't, when I was in law school, I didn't get, I would get a lot of interviews because of my grades, but I, only managed to get a summer associate job because someone that I'd grown up with was best friends with the hiring partner who came to my school like when she was in college. And so, I got that job based on a connection. I probably wouldn't have because I would go into interviews and I would just talk about my asphalt business and all these papers I'd written about race and ethnicity when I was in law school. And I figured, that people really want to hear me talk and really want to hear about everything I've done, but none of that was related to the practice of law. And so I realized, when I wrote all these things down that I was being, talking too much and I needed to, find out what they needed and talk about, how, very direct and things about practicing law was important. And so I learned what I'd done wrong in my interviews. And then I learned what I'd done wrong on my resume. Like I needs to be focused on one thing. And then even my cover letters were embarrassing. My cover letters, when I was applying to firms like an unsolicited manner, were often, 3 or 4 pages, just going into great detail about all these leadership roles I'd had and all this asphalt business and all these things were unrelated. And it was just ridiculous. And so much so that I showed it to a guy in law school and he circulated it around and people thought it was funny and kind of made fun of me. But I mean, that's how bad my cover letters were. So I learned a cover letter just needs to be very short and direct. So I made these changes and then what I did, which most people don't do, my fiance at the time went to New York, where her family was New York City. And I decided I wasn't going to go back to New York City because that was where she was. So I decided I was going to apply to firms in Los Angeles, even though, keep in mind, I had never been to Los Angeles and never even been to California. But I decided that was what I was going to do. So fix my resume, fix my cover letter. I started thinking about all the things that I had done wrong when I was interviewing as for summer associate jobs and other jobs. I started thinking about all those things and writing them down. So I fixed my resume, fixed my cover letter, and then I did something that most people don't do. And this is something that I recommend that everyone do when you're trying to apply to firms that may not have openings. I went to Staples and I bought $400 or $500 worth of very expensive stationery, like crane stationery. I had researched using the judges' computers all the firms in Los Angeles that did litigation in Los Angeles, and that ended up being a list of probably 350 law firms. And I wrote very short, direct cover letters saying, I'm interested in doing, commercial litigation at the highest level, and I'd love to, talk to your firm if I can help you. And so I sent these letters to, 450 law firms, and you have to do that. You have to not just apply to like 1 or 2 places or 3 places. I mean, that's just absolutely crazy, or 10 places. And, what most students at my University of Virginia Law School would do is when they would apply to firms in a city, they would go and just, if there were 30 firms in the NALP guide, which used to be printed, but, NALP has the best firms in different cities. You can download them from their website. They would only apply to those instead of applying to, hold on 1 second. Yes?
That slide is still on the first slide.
I know. Thanks. So they would only apply to those firms, but I applied to like 450 firms. And, pretty soon after sending those applications out, I started getting calls and I got maybe 7 or 10 interviews out of that. And then when I got those interviews, I, flew out to Los Angeles and I got interviews at good firms. And when I went into those firms, I did everything that I hadn't done in all the interviews before. I made sure that I spoke to I didn't talk about all these other things that I'd done. I made sure that I only talked about litigation. I made sure that I would ask people like, what kind of, what would make me successful here? Like, how, I would, what would success look like here, like 30 or 90 days out, and really came out as someone that looked like they were on the side of the employers. I took all this ridiculous stuff off my resume about papers that I'd written and being in the Republican Club and everything. And I went out and got these interviews and got, several offers by doing that. And because I was just very direct, I didn't talk too much about myself. I didn't talk about things that had nothing to do with practicing law or working in commercial litigation, and was just very, very focused. And I had to learn all this stuff. I'm just telling you because if I hadn't done that, my entire legal career would have been over. Uh, and I didn't have the bar, and and so I had to tell firms, I'm going to take the bar, the next bar at this time, and it just looks very, very bad. But the firm I ended up choosing was Quinn Emanuel, and I never would have found that firm. It was a very small firm at that time, like 40 attorneys, and they weren't on any of these NALP lists or anything, and they were just like, one of these 450 firms that were on this list that I generated for the judge. And I got a job there and it was great. They gave me a clerkship bonus. They paid me money to take the bar. It was just awesome. And I liked the people and it was good. So that's how I ended up getting my job after getting fired. I learned all those lessons that I made, those mistakes that you need to come out on the side of the employer. You need to look like, you're only doing one thing because law firms all hire specialists. When you see jobs, they're not looking for people that do three different practice areas. They're looking for people that do one. So you should always just make your resume like that and have nothing on your resume that looks controversial or like you're on the side of one political party or the other. So I did that and it worked very well for me. I mean, I got most of the jobs that I interviewed for, but just keep in mind, I sent 450 applications and I only got 7 interviews. It was interesting too, one of the jobs that I didn't get, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that. I got an interview with this very small litigation firm in Los Angeles that had maybe, 12 or 15 attorneys or something. And I went in and I was interviewing with an associate. It was a beautiful office, like in Century City overlooking a golf course, and interviewed with him. And he said, "Where else are you interviewing with?" And I just, spit it out like I'm interviewing with Latham and Watkins, Morrison and Forrester, and like, these big firms. And he said, "Well, why, this is a small firm, like someone that interviews in those firms, isn't interested in a boutique firm." So I didn't get that job because I looked like I was someone that wasn't interested in a boutique, and I'd gone in there kind of arrogant and stuff. And so, you have to talk in a way that is, when you're interviewing, that looks like you want to do exactly what that employer does. I remember there was this really smart guy when I was watching interviews. I was in law school, like doing these on-campus interviews, and he's a guy he ended up working at Latham, but he was just a superstar in law review and everything. And there was a really small firm in South Carolina that was like 10 people or something that he was interviewing with, and I could hear him because I was sitting outside the door of his interview, and all he was doing was like, talking about, how he dreamed of working in a small law firm in a small market and why it's better and all these things. And he just was very, very prepared, and he got that job. And he got jobs at Latham and SCAD and all these places because he talked in terms of the interest of the employer. So you just have to think about that. Like, are you talking and acting in terms of the interest of the employer? So that was a little bit about why I got fired and a little bit about how to kind of react when you get fired. Fix your resume, you fix your cover letter, you apply to a lot of places, and people do get fired. I mean, most attorneys are going to get fired at one point in their career. So I went out to Los Angeles, which was awesome, and I started working in this Quinn Emanuel firm, and I learned, the importance of, working really, really hard. So I worked as much as I possibly could because I knew that it was what law firms required. So I worked as many hours as I possibly could. I, would get work for people. I would look like I was on the side of the employer. And while I was there were maybe, 12 or 13 summer associates, and our associates had started, and there were people that were immediately like they weren't on the side of the employer. And those people ended up, with very, very quickly, like within 6 months, I don't know if they got fired, but they left. And it was kind of strange because these were people that, very strong, but they were just doing things that weren't on the side of the employer. Like one guy took a call or called a reporter about one of his cases, and it got written up in the newspaper, and it was just crazy stuff that people did that looked like they weren't on the side of the employer. So those people ended up, leaving. And then there were other people there that, weren't cultural fits. And so they didn't, associate with people, and they ended up leaving. And so, very quickly within like, the first year. So So I was there and doing the best work that I could. And one day, and there was a partner actually that kind of took me under his wing too. And he started helping me like write more directly and doing all these things and having really good writing and briefs and things. And it was very, very helpful. And I improved and I did a lot of work and I did good work for people and more partners would give me work when I did good work. And that's just another thing you need to learn is, every time you go in and you get an assignment from someone, like you want that person to give you work. You want that person to want to give you work in the future because you want to do like a better job as an associate than anybody else would do for them. So, you need to look, you need to basically go in to every person you get an assignment for and try to do the best possible work you can because if you do, you're going to get, extra work. And so I did that. I did that with every person I worked for. And they started giving me more and more work. And I would take those assignments. And, at one point, like I had so much work that they brought in like extra file cabinets and things. And so my office had like was just filled with file cabinets because I had so many cases. And I was doing a good job and I was getting repeated work. So at the same time, there were some new associates that were, on my floor that didn't have any work. Like no one was giving them work, and they weren't giving them work because when they did work, they weren't turning in the best possible stuff. And so other partners, those partners wouldn't give them repeated work. And it's important because when you're working for people, and this is one reason people get bad performance reviews, if you don't do the best work you possibly can, they're not going to give you extra work in the future. And they're also partners talk among each other all the time. They're also not going to give you extra work. They're going to talk about you and say this person doesn't do good work or this person's making all these mistakes. And that's going to, it can impact, how things go for you. Like, so if you're not getting repeated work. So this is one reason why people get bad performance reviews. You may do work for one person that is not good. And because of that, you'll end up getting a bad performance review. So you have to do absolutely, the best possible work you can for everybody that you're working for. If you don't do that, then you're going to end up getting bad performance reviews. So your whole goal in any law firm, I just want to make sure you understand this. Your whole goal is to, regardless of the stage of your career, is to always have work to do. So an attorney that doesn't have work to do is dead in the water. And what does that mean? That means, as an associate, you need to always be getting extra work for people. You always need to be improving, impressing the people you're working with and look like you're the right-hand person and do the best possible work you can. There are partners in every major American law firm that just did incredible work for one powerful partner. And that powerful partner that with a lot of business just gave them work and they might have worked exclusively for them. And that partner, like with so much business and things, ended up making them, a partner and make because the partners with business have a lot of leverage. And, these people are partners in AmLaw, 100 law firms, like making, in some cases, millions of dollars a year just because they did good work for one person, but had a lot of power. So you need to do good work. If you do good work and you impress people and you get more work, you will do well and you will typically get very good performance reviews, and especially if you're working hard and that sort of thing. And that's really, one of the most important things to keep in mind. So there's another thing, when I talk about the importance of always having work, you need to get the hours and you need to impress the right people. But in the importance of having a lot of work, I'll tell you an example that I thought was, is very telling. So I was working with a guy that was an associate at a big law firm in New York. And they had this thing where in order to get work in his practice area, there was one partner that was in the Boston office that would every Monday morning at 8 a.m. she would send out a list of work that she had, and someone, the first person to email her back with, or take an assignment would get it. And he was like, I'm not coming into work at 8 a.m., on a Monday to get work. People in New York typically get to work around 10 or 9:30. I'm not doing that. That's demeaning. And so he never got any work. And so he didn't have any hours and he got fired from this job after, 6 or 8 months or something. It was his first job. And because he didn't have any work. And so, that's one of the most important things is getting work. And it's sad. I mean, this guy, very smart, like went to Columbia and all these things. And he couldn't get any interviews because in New York, if you get fired that early, I mean, you're competing against people that aren't fired. And so one day he got an interview at one firm and he had a full round of interviews and he went into, it was a big firm. He went into his first interview and the guy said, "Oh my God, I didn't realize you were unemployed. This isn't going to work and I'm sorry." And so they sent him home. It was very sad. And I don't think that guy, he didn't have any work. So getting work is very, very important. And you will be reviewed to the extent you do good work for people and you get more work from them because that's a sign that you're doing good work. You will often not get performance reviews right away in firms, and you will often be worried about how you're doing. And when and you do get performance reviews, you may not understand, but the big thing is you will get good performance reviews if you're doing good work. So when I was at Quinn, a couple things happened. So when I was in about 6 months in, there was a partner that was kind of not the best guy, and he was going on vacation. He sent a memo to another partner that was looking that was going to help him make sure that his cases went forward and everything. And the partner had given me some of the work from this guy, and in it I saw this memo, and in the memo he said, Harrison and this other associate are green, meaning we were new associates, and so you need to look over the work carefully. And then he had some mid-level associates that he was just saying, to do this. And so I was like, wow, that's a bad review. Like I'm very scared about that. Maybe I should start looking for another job. And then about 6 months, 2 months later, like there was another partner. I asked him how I'm doing, and he said, well, you have room to improve and stuff like that. So that scared me as well. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get fired. And so eventually I left that firm and resigned because I thought there's so much work here that I will never be able to bring in cases and I will never have power as a partner. And so I'm going to go work for this other firm. And, because I figured partners need to have business and it would be hard to get business there because you're working all the time. But when I resigned, all these partners came into my office, like several of them, and asked me not to quit. And John Quinn called me on the phone on the way to work and asked me not to quit. Then he came into my office and told me he thought I should stay and was very nice to me. And I did things like saying, well, I thought I was going to get litigation cases and, I want to do trials and things and I'm not getting trials here. And he said, well, what if I get you a trial within, 3 months or something? I mean, just really nice and trying to keep me working at the firm. So I was doing really well, but I went over to this firm, Dewey Ballantyne, and Dewey Ballantyne in Los Angeles. It was a branch office of a large New York law firm. Dewey Ballantyne at the time was, not the partners and things weren't doing very well there. They didn't have a lot of work. They've been brought over as laterals, and that firm had probably billing rates that were double of what the billing rates were at the previous firm. So a lot of them didn't have a lot of work. And I got there and I saw like all these partners starting to leave and or get fired, and that was very scary. And several of them would just sit in their office like playing solitaire on their computers because they didn't have any work. It was very just crazy. So I started at the firm, and I had this one partner that I was doing all my work for, and I think he liked my work and was giving me like a lot of repetitive work. And I think I've been hired to work with him. And he had some big clients like the Sultan of Brunei and other people. And I would work on these cases for him, and I was doing good work. And I think he liked my work. And when he would give me a memo or something to write, I would go into as much detail as he wanted. I would work, 200 hours on a memo about something. I mean, just whatever it took to do good work. And he would, encourage me to work hard and to bill a lot of hours, even on cases that were just, pretty stupid. I mean, they were, but representing like the Sultan of Brunei, for example. So I would work really, really hard on these things. And it was interesting. I'll just tell you a kind of a quick aside. When I was working for him, he would ask me to just go into all this detail. Like he would, instead of like we had this case where the Hotel Bel Air, which the Sultan of Brunei or his brother or something owned, had sold a cigar to someone out of a little humidor they kept behind the desk and didn't have a cancer warning on the humidor. So they'd sued the Hotel Bel Air. And instead of settling it, we just fought it and did all these things. And he made me write all these memos, and it was kind of interesting. So much detail. Like we went and we actually looked at like the legislative debates in the California legislature about this rule and how, it had to be like, I mean, all these different things. And it was amazing because it was a class action, and I was so prepared and had all this detail that there were all these lawyers from every big firm in LA. And I got into this hearing and I was giving notes about what this person, there was this famous woman from Latham that was an environmental attorney, was arguing. And I went into all this detail, and like she got up there and like actually took my arguments. I was one of like 30 attorneys in the room, and it was about how the person wasn't a nonprofit, or it wasn't. It was anyway. It was just going into all this detail, and I just knocked it out of the park. And so, but the point is, I learned from him to go into a lot of detail. So I was doing good work for him. I learned, the importance of, impressing people. But then one day I got an assignment from this woman at the firm that it was a very complex matter about $550 million that was supposed to be released to the Philippine government from a Swiss bank. And so there are all these different laws and things that apply. And it was very complex, and it was very, very hard to understand. And so, I worked literally at one point, I came into work on a Thursday, and I left on a Sunday morning, to go home. So I got home at like 3 in the morning on Sunday. I worked like 72 hours straight or something. I got home at like 3 in the morning on a Sunday, and I didn't get to sleep because I was so jacked up on coffee and everything until probably 5 a.m. And then at 9 a.m., she called me and she's like, "Where's my memo?" And I was like, "I've already done it. And, I sent it to you." And she said, "I need you to go into the office right now and resend it." And I think I actually told her no. I said, "I sent it. I'm positive." And I got so upset, like I hung down the phone, and I took my arm and I like jammed it into the side of a wall, and ended up, just my whole arm like went numb and I couldn't feel it. I went back to bed, and then I called her. It was Easter Sunday. I called her like 2 hours later, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I received it. It's fine." And what had happened is they turned off the computers in the New York office to like run some sort of stuff every Sunday morning when they didn't think people were working, and so the emails were delayed. But anyway, so I worked for her, and the work was so complex that she couldn't understand it, and so she would read it and have all these, but wasn't understanding what I was writing, and I knew what I was saying, but it was very, very difficult to understand. And so she kept getting mad at me, and I was like kind of condescending. I'm like, "Well, you didn't understand this point, and this point." And then I actually at one point went to her husband, who was very, very smart in the firm, very smart guy, and I explained it to him so he could explain it to her. And that was just really, really stupid. So the work was completed. I was talking to a partner in the Hong Kong office, and I explained to him like how I didn't think she understood it. And so at that point she got, was really no longer on my side. So I ended up, being in a position where, I wasn't doing well in that firm because I'd upset her and upset all of her friends. So in the firm. So they'll just tell you kind of this final performance review that I had. I went into the office of, I was sitting in my office, and the reviews were being done by partners that had come out from New York, and they would go into one office and march in there, and then they would march into the other one. And it's kind of a funny story, but they marched into my office and started giving me this horrible review, like you're not doing well, like there's all these problems, and we're not even going to talk about. I mean, there was this scary review, like you're going to have to start looking for another job. And I was just terrified. And they said, "We're not even going to talk about what happened with Bob Woodward or some partner there." And I said, "I never worked for Bob Woodward. What are you talking about?" And they started like reviewing their notes, and they're like, "Oh, we're sorry, we've got the wrong person." And then they just marched out. So I never had a review there. But I'd upset this woman. Because I upset her, I upset her friends, and she was in kind of a bad position there, like she'd been de-equitized or something. But I'd upset her. So I realized that my brand was kind of burned at that firm, and I needed to do something else. And so I ended up, quitting, and they told me to go talk to recruiters. And then I learned about the recruiting business and started doing what I'm doing today. So, I'm trying to give everyone, some insight about performance reviews and why you get a bad performance review, trying to work for the right people, and kind of how reviews work. And I'm going to tell you a couple other quick stories about how associates are reviewed, so you can understand, how it works. So I was working in next to this office of this junior associate, this first year associate, and I was like a third year associate at that point. I was working in this office right next to him, and one day, he'd been there like 6 months or something. This partner marched into his office and started, yelling at him and just berating him and telling him, how bad he was doing. And I could hear it through the walls. And I was like, wow. I mean, because he wasn't yelling, he was talking very loud. And I heard that. And then I, after that, this guy was just completely broken and started working really, really hard. He put a espresso machine in his office. But, I thought that this guy was like going to lose his job. And I talked to another a mid-level associate about it. He said, no, this guy's from this big firm. He was from Skadden or something. And he said, or I don't remember what a big firm. And he said, that's, how they train junior associates. They give them very, very bad reviews because they're trying to, make their work improve. And this is just, what this guy does with every junior associate. So you need to understand, like, a lot of times if you're a junior associate, like, what's going to happen is you're going to get very bad reviews to improve your work. And that's really something that, you need to keep in mind, that even when you're junior, you typically get very bad reviews. And then when you're senior, when you're mid-level associate, you start getting very, very good reviews, because as a mid-level associate, you know what you're doing. You're very valuable to the firm, and you have learned your practice area fairly well. You can do work without a lot of supervision, and you're very profitable because partners love, to give work to mid-level associates, and junior associates often, because they don't know what they're doing, their work's written off. So, you need to understand, as a junior associate, bad reviews. When you get into being a mid-level associate, you'll start getting good reviews because the law firm wants to keep you, and you typically know what you're doing. You haven't left, and so you'll start getting good reviews. And so it's important to understand kind of how that works. And then as you become a more senior associate, then the reviews start getting, they'll say you're on the right track and everything. As a mid-level associate, you're doing well. And then because you're profitable and they don't want you to leave, and this is when associates are the most marketable, is when you're mid-level associate. And then when you get to be senior level at law firms that are, don't have a lot of places for partners, then your reviews start getting a little nebulous, and, they'll say, things that might not be that positive. And then at some point, in most large law firms, they will tell you you're not going to make partner, and then you need to start looking for a job. So, what do you do in that? How do you cope with that, like the negative reviews when you get more senior? You have to generally, you'll have to start, looking for a job, and that's kind of scary. So, you need to position yourself often in a firm where you think you're going to make partner. I'll just give you, so what lies ahead when you're getting reviews from firms, what kind of happens the rest of your career. So when you become a partner at law firms, you start getting reviewed as well. So you'll get reviewed. You may be a income partner, and you'll start getting reviewed for, your ability to bring in business, or if the firm has a lot of work, you'll start getting reviewed. You'll get okay reviews or good reviews. But generally at some point, if you become a partner, you will start. They will review partners in large law firms, and they'll review them for their ability to bring in work and things like that. And the same things apply when you become a partner. Is if you look like you're not on the side of the employer, then the employer will get rid of you. I had a guy in Phoenix a couple months ago, and he was a partner. He'd been a partner at a law firm for 20 years, like a good law firm, a big, 80-person or something law firm in Phoenix. And some sort of political issue happened in the firm. And because of that political issue, he took one side. And because he took one side, the management of the firm that wasn't on that side ended up firing him. And he came to me and was like, I have 1 month to find a position. And he was just very, very, aggressive trying to find a job. And so, that kind of taught me, that, you have to be on the side of the employer, through any type of performance review that you receive. So, what do you do when you receive a negative performance review? Because, you may receive a negative performance review, and you need to understand, like, where is that coming from? And typically what will happen is a negative performance review will happen because you don't have enough work, you haven't done good enough work for the people that assigned you work, you're making mistakes, or you are viewed as someone that's not on the side of the law firm. So those are kind of the major things that need to be fixed. If your work qualities, criticized, then you need to start immediately improving it and doing whatever you can to produce the best possible work. And that means, you can prove things with ChatGPT and things and make sure that the work is really good, but you have to start, doing the kind of work that the partners want. Other partners, by the way, when they have work, will expect you to work very, very hard, and they will want lots of hours on it. And you often cannot question that. I had a guy I was working with in Washington, D.C., that lost his job. And he lost his job at a big, like New York based law firm that had a good sized office in Washington, D.C. And he got an assignment. He's a very smart guy, he graduated at the very top of his class from the University Law School. And he had this assignment for this guy, and he was very, very smart. The guy asked him to, spend the next couple of weeks like writing memos or working on it or something. And so we got the assignment, and then within like 6 or 7 hours, he concluded that none of this work was necessary because the law was 100% on the side of whatever, and there was no way to, whatever he was asked to do wouldn't apply. And so there was a new partner that had this was like their first big client, and the client would have allowed him to work all these hours. And he went and said, you don't need to do this. And then the guy said, do it anyway. And then he started talking negatively about this partner and ended up getting fired like 6 months into his job. It was very, very sad. And he got interviews at Boyce Schiller. I got him interviews at Boyce Schiller. And I also got him interviews at Quinn Emanuel. And he called every recruiter he could find. And everyone was just like, we don't have any jobs for attorneys with 6 months. And unfortunately, he didn't get the job at Boyce Schiller. And then he also got the job at Quinn, but then he was conflicted out. And when that happened, he literally dropped out of the practice of law. And he ended up, 6 months later, opening his own law firm representing criminals. And so, just criminal law firm. And it's very sad. I mean, it's just like his career ended because he didn't do what the person wanted. So you need to do what people want. You need to get repeated work. You need to get a lot of hours. And when, if you don't have a lot of hours, you're typically going to get bad performance reviews. If your work doesn't improve, you're going to get bad performance reviews. So you always need to be trying to get as much work and hours as you can. A lot of times, this is just another thing that will hurt you at law firms and hurt your career. A lot of times, you will get negative performance reviews, in your career, because there's, certain things, that you do related to getting more and more work, or to, so not doing, as much work as you can, and figuring out like what partners want you to do a lot of work. A lot of times when partners bring in business, they want you to do a lot of work because the client will pay for it. So, that's your value as an associate, is doing as much work as possible. And if you don't, then you're going to get in trouble. If you don't look like you're on the side of the firm, you're going to get in trouble. So sometimes you'll get bad reviews because, you just seem like, you're someone that could be on the way out, and that may hurt you. And sometimes, that'll happen. So, you just need to be very careful of that. Other things that can happen in performance reviews are sometimes, when you're junior and your work's getting criticized, you don't need to take it that seriously, but you need to, make sure, that anytime something happens, and you get a negative performance review, that you take that information and you improve. Now, I'll tell you one thing that often happens. Law firms will tell you sometimes that, they will indicate that you're not doing well. Maybe you should start looking around. And if that happens, you need to be very, very aggressive in your job search and apply to a lot of places. What happened with a guy from the University of Chicago Law School, when I got him interviews at Boyce Schiller and Quinn Emanuel, is I applied him to like over 100 firms because I didn't know what would happen. And there weren't any jobs for him. That's how we got those interviews. You need to do the same thing. Like if you think your job is at risk, you need to start applying to a lot of places, not just places with openings, because people's careers end all the time when they don't do that. So negative performance reviews, if it looks like you have to look for a job, that's what you need to do as well, is, just go very aggressively look for a job. When you get negative performance reviews, another thing that's important to do, especially if you're a junior associate, is to find mentors that might be mid-level associates or senior associates and start asking them what's required and and how what you need to do before you turn in work. And that can help you, to make sure that you're doing that as well. So those are, some of the major pieces of advice that I have about performance reviews. I'm going to take questions in just a little bit about it, but I just want to make sure that that you're kind of aware of what happens. When you go to different firms too, just one other thing that I think is important to explain. I was thinking last night, I don't know why, I was actually dreaming about it, how different the cultures of like Quinn Emanuel were compared to the cultures of this firm that I went to, Dewey Valentine. So the culture and this is a very important point about what type of firm you should be at and why you may get bad performance reviews. So the culture at Quinn Emanuel was you could wear shorts there, you could wear t-shirts, you could, show up to work and kind of any way you wanted. And it was very loosey goosey, like people would drink and get drunk and use, chew tobacco in the office and things. And it was very informal. People would grow their hair long, all this sort of thing. And it was a different culture. And so people that fit in with that culture would do well, and people that didn't wouldn't. And I learned that there. But then when I went to Dewey Valentine, it was like, you had your name on the door. It was like Mr. Barnes. They had a plaque on your door that said that. They would, in addition to that, they would, everyone had to wear a suit to work, and people were, just very formal about everything. And it was a completely different culture. And so certain people would fit into that culture and others wouldn't. So anytime you're at a law firm, a lot of what happens in performance reviews is you may not be really a fit for that culture. And it's important to understand that a lot of your success in the firm, if you fit in with a culture and the people there, you're going to get good reviews. If you don't fit in with that culture, often you're going to get bad reviews. So you need to fit in, with the culture of the firm and make sure that, that you look like someone that, matches that. And if you don't have a firm that matches your culture, you're often going to get bad reviews. So, what kind of people are you comfortable with? What kind of people that you automatically kind of connect with? And if you're not in a culture like that, you're often going to get bad reviews. And you should try to find a firm that matches the culture of what you're seeking. One other thing I recommend also with performance reviews is, when you get these negative reviews as a junior associate, you shouldn't take them seriously. But, if you're at a firm when they don't have a lot of work often, what'll happen is instead of giving you good reviews, they'll start giving people bad reviews because they don't want the expense of the people that are there. So that's another thing you need to understand. If a firm doesn't have a lot of work, they're often going to give you bad performance reviews just because they don't have a lot of work. They're giving you these bad performance reviews not because of anything you've done wrong, just because they want people to leave. And that can be, demoralizing because you're suddenly getting these bad reviews because, there's not a lot of work. When you get bad reviews, so you need to just realize it can often be cultural based, or it can often be because you're not doing the type of there's just not enough work there. So performance reviews, just all sorts of things can happen, and you just need to be very, very careful about everything that happens. When you get bad reviews, if the culture doesn't match, you need to try to figure out how you can fit in the culture, or find a firm that matches your culture. And if you don't find a firm if you try to work in a firm that doesn't match your culture, you're often not going to do well. One of my first interviews when I came to Los Angeles was a firm named Heller Ehrman that's no longer in existence. And they had these incredible, everyone there had been a clerk and been like board of the coif at top law schools. It was kind of a small office in Los Angeles. And I interviewed there, and I went in there, and the men were all wearing like these very tight t-shirts, and they had jewelry on. Some of them had tattoos, and they had like, American Spirit cigarettes on their desk and things. And the culture completely didn't match me. And I remember the woman called me, that she's still a recruiting coordinator from Los Angeles. She called me and I didn't get the job. And she said, it's just this culture doesn't work. It's not going to match for you. So that's often the case too when you get into a firm where you don't match the culture. So just a couple other points about performance reviews that I just want to make sure you understand is anytime a law firm gives you a performance review, you need to basically take down everything that they say and really make sure that you learn from it and take things seriously and do whatever you can to improve. I had an interesting thing happen also recently. A woman So a lot of times when you go into performance reviews, they may not say anything negative. And so you ask them, well, just tell me what I can do to be better. Tell me what I can do. And so you'll ask them for that sort of information. And then they will often, not have anything to say. They'll be like, no, you're doing fine. But sometimes they will. I had this incredibly talented woman. She had gone to, this is recently, she went to Stanford Law School. She had some sort of really complex engineering degree from, Carnegie Mellon or something, and done really well at Stanford. And she was working in a major New York law firm where she was billing like 2,800 hours a year, and just very, very dedicated, and just an incredible resume. And she went into this firm and she said, they said, well, we don't really, know what to tell you. Maybe your writing could improve a little. So they told her writing needed to improve. And she was like so like dedicated to like being a good attorney that she went and got a clerkship and left her job, which I just thought was crazy. But I don't think you need to take things that seriously. But those are some of my major thoughts about performance reviews. I'm sorry that there weren't a lot of slides here. I thought that it would be beneficial to, tell you stories and kind of how, you can improve in response to performance reviews that, may not, may not be, as positive as you would like them to be. And often it's just because of, what level you're at, or because you don't fit the culture, because you're not getting enough work, or because you upset certain people, or because you take the side of people that are against the firm and not for the firm. So those are, some of the major things I think I can tell you. I think, one of the things I will say about performance reviews too, that's very, very difficult, especially for, younger associates is, or, new attorneys is, all your career, your work is, when you've been in law school and you've been in college, your work has always been praised. You've got good grades, you've done well, and suddenly you get into a law firm, and all these things are happening that are prevent, you're getting negative reviews, and sometimes people will just leave the practice of law, like they're from, they went to, Yale or something, and they don't like this, and they just feel like they don't fit, or they, instead of improving. And so when you become a new attorney, really what's happening is your first 5 years you're learning to practice here, and you're kind of learning how to get in, work with the culture, and you're learning how to get work. And so if you don't do that and take things seriously, you're going to have problems. Yeah, so those are, I think, I apologize for not showing these slides. I thought it would be more beneficial for everyone to kind of hear about performance reviews and how they, how you can improve in response to them. Just a couple other things that, can, mess you up is, when I talked to you earlier about law firms monitoring your communications and things, what they see is if they see anything negative that you're saying about them, then they realize you're not on their side. And so that's one of the reasons that they do that. So you need to be very careful of your behavior in the office and who you talk to, and all these sorts of things, and what sites you visit, and how much time you spend on those sites. And it was interesting. This is just, I'm just telling you about the importance of being on the side of the firm. Used to be a website called Greedy Associates, and people would, actually might have been Above the Law. Someone had posted this long kind of screed against their firm that was very, very negative, and it was anonymous, but the law firm was very, very angry about it. And they knew it was someone that was in their firm, and I think on Above the Law it was timestamped, like when the comment had come in or something. So the law firm was one of these firms that monitored communications and things, and they went and they saw that this associate was on this website and on this page where the comment was made at this certain time. And I don't know if they recorded a screen or not, but they found that and immediately fired him. And that was a big firm. So, it's just something, to be aware of. One other point, and then I will take a quick break. We'll take questions. But, you just, this sort of stuff, can, often, be very, very upsetting. People will often leave firms, like go to a succession of firms, because once they get a bad performance review, even as a junior attorney, then they'll look for a new job, and they'll keep doing that to avoid criticism. And it's not something, when you get a bad performance review, you really need to listen to what happened and fix it, and take those lessons to hopefully a new firm. When if you feel like you need to leave, and like learn all this stuff. And performance reviews are like, a good thing, because they're going to tell you, what you're doing wrong. And it's not enough to just do good work. You have to be able to get along with the people you're working with, and you have to be able to identify with them. I love telling these stories because I think that they're beneficial. There's a lot of people that approach working in firms almost like a working class type of thing. Like they approach working in a firm, meaning like they're there, they're going to provide a service and get paid. And that's like the stupidest way to try to get a job. I remember I was talking to a woman, she had gone to University of Michigan Law School, then she got to University of Michigan, got an engineering degree. She was a patent attorney, and I was talking to her, and she was from a very working class background, let's put it that way. And she was working at this firm, and she had been, wasn't working. And I tried to ask her all these questions, like to kind of humanize her as, asking her personal questions about, her life and where she grew up and things, because I wanted to make sure that when I was submitting her to firms, that I was submitting her like as a person and not just as a worker. And she said, none of this matters. Like the only thing that matters is, that I can do the work. And if they hire me, they know I can do the work because it's on my resume, and you don't need any of these details. And after the call, like I got off the call, I just was like shocked. I couldn't believe that she acted this way. So I looked her up some more, and I found out that she'd worked for a firm in whatever, some city, and then had sued, like a big firm like in Chicago, and had lost her job, and then had sued them, and then had sued a hairdresser for giving her bad coloring or something. And so certain people approach things and think that they just need to be doing the work. But doing the work's not enough. I mean, you need to, people that sue their employers are obviously employers most of the time. And if you do sue an employer, you're going to have a very hard time ever getting another job. It's not a good move, almost regardless of what happens. And so that happened. And yeah, so I'm going to take a quick break. And then when I come back, I will take questions. We'll just take a break for like 1 or 2 minutes. I apologize if I hope this was interesting to most people. I went into a lot of detail today about performance reviews because I think it's important to learn about it from, not just from from a perspective of getting work, from a perspective of a cultural fit. All these sorts of things are really, make a difference for you when you're working with people. Also, just a couple other points because I'm trying to give you as much detail as possible to think about all this. When you're working for a firm, you need to be very, very careful about saying anything negative about yourself, because if you say anything negative about yourself, people will use it against you. If you say you have a drinking problem, they'll use it against you. If you say, you something personal about your life that seems a little bit off, that will hurt you. And so people will use anything you say personally about yourself that doesn't look good. It will be used against you and can hurt you. So you always need to be aware of that. Another woman I saw get fired, she was working for a partner in Silicon Valley, and she was a trademark attorney working for this very important partner. And the partner used to come in and talk to her about her personal life. And so she would listen to all these things about how the woman was on dating apps and things and went on bad days. And she would listen to all these things. And then one day the woman came in and told her that some guy she met at a Club Med event thing, came out and visited her, and they had sex all weekend, and showed the partner that. And the partner just got very, very angry and thought that was inappropriate. She lost her job, and she's a trademark attorney. There weren't a lot of trademark jobs in California, and she ended up going into a completely different career. So you need to be very, very careful about your personal life, because if you get that involved when talking to people, that can hurt you as well. Okay, so we'll take a quick break, and then when I come back, I'll answer questions. I would encourage everyone to ask as many questions as possible as you have about this topic, because I can answer them, and I can answer questions for you if you had bad performance reviews. And I can also answer any questions that you may have about your career, what's going on, and things that have happened. And, this is kind of an unusual webinar. I did it kind of in a narrative style without PowerPoints, because I wanted to, approach this in a way that I hope is interesting and gives you an insight into, how you need to handle your career and to avoid bad performance reviews, and then kind of how you should respond to them. Okay, so let's go to questions. Questions are one of my favorite times of the week because, I love to hear what people are thinking, and just go. Doesn't look like there's a ton of questions. So the more questions you can ask, the better. Okay, the first question: how can I distinguish between performance-based critiques versus politically motivated feedback? For example, a partner I haven't worked much with gives me a low score. Is that a signal I should be worried about my standing with the firm as a whole? I'm thinking whether it's time to quietly start looking elsewhere. And I'd appreciate your take on these reviews when these become job search signals. Okay, so one thing I would say to you, anybody, that's very, very important, when you're in a law firm, because you never know, what's going on, and you never know, how seriously you need to take performance reviews. The other thing I recommend for everyone, and I'm just telling you this, because I've seen what happens, is you should always, always be aware of the market, like what's going on. So, that means, you use Indeed, LinkedIn, and then also Law Crossing. And Law Crossing is my site. So, but I'm telling you what Law Crossing does. It, reviews all the websites out there of firms, all websites of law firms and in-house and so forth, their websites, and shows jobs. And these Indeed and LinkedIn, you have to pay to be there. So you're not seeing, law firms have to pay to be there. So you're not seeing, all the jobs that are in the market. Law Crossing will show you that. So you should always be aware of the market. And if you feel like your career is in danger, then you can always be applying to places if you feel like it's in danger in this particular type of thing. So your question is politically motivated feedback. So politically motivated feedback means that you may be on the wrong side of the firm politically in terms of the culture, and so you need to be aware of that, and that could be politically motivated feedback. If a partner you haven't worked with gives you a low score, I don't know why that would happen, but that often that doesn't mean that you're in trouble, and it could be that partner is reviewing you for other people. But if someone you haven't worked for is giving you a low score, then that doesn't make any sense if you haven't worked for them. But if that partner is giving you reviews on behalf of other people, that may be something to be worried about. Reviews don't necessarily become job search signals when you're a junior associate. They are given in that way to make you improve as an attorney, because you're not doing a lot of things right. You need to learn. But if you're getting a low review and there's plenty of work and you're getting plenty of work, then you're probably okay. And so that's kind of the best thing I can tell you. But if you're worried about your job search standing, you should always be aware of the market and what's out there. And you should always be aware of different cultures and firms. And you should always be trying to network with people outside of your firm, for the potential that they can help you in the future. Okay, next question. Let me just see here, fix this. I'm just trying to fix this. Assuming a situation where a firm has a yearly performance review appraisal and request a summary of milestones. This question. Assuming a situation where a firm has a yearly performance review appraisal and request for summary of milestones accomplishments to be submitted before each review, which will then be reviewed by the appraiser, what advice would you give to ensure there is an even spread of milestones accomplishments so there is an impression of continuous growth and progress being achieved? Okay, that's a very, very good question. So one of the things that the best attorneys do, not all attorneys do this, but the best attorneys do this when they're looking for jobs and also when they're at firms, is they will write down like all the stuff that they've done. Like if they wrote a summary judgment motion, they'll write that down. They successfully argued a motion, they'll write that down. And they kind of track all the stuff that they've done. And the corporate attorneys do this. They'll have transaction sheets that go at the end. And patent attorneys will do this. They'll have an attachment of all the patents. And real estate attorneys will do this with their transactions. And so they don't just have like a one-page resume. They're like tracking all the work that they've done. And that's actually very interesting, because those attorneys that do that get the most jobs. And so, you should be writing down the things that you've done, and keeping like, keeping them. So you can talk about them. So when you go, if someone's asking you for a summary of milestones and accomplishments, then, you need to make sure that you write down, you have everything you've done written down, and show kind of the things that you've done to the firm. And so some people, when they're asked to do that, will not provide a lot of information. It's interesting. You may remember the recent thing that happened with Elon Musk asking government attorneys to write down 5 things that they did in the previous week, with the idea that they probably weren't doing a lot, and that would be a way to get rid of people. So when you write down you need to have, you should be keeping a list of everything you've done, and that actually is very good. The best attorneys do that. They do that on their resumes often with attachments. But if you're able to do that, then that shows you have a lot of pride for your work. And so you need to be, writing everything you've done down, because that's good for not only your resume, but that shows, places that, that you're enthusiastic about what you've done, and that will show growth. So everybody should be doing that. Most people don't. But I can tell you that the attorneys that get jobs, the most jobs do that. I can tell you that, when I work with people like from the best possible firms like Sullivan and Cromwell and things, they almost always do that with the resume. So that's a very, important thing to make sure that you're always keeping track of the work that you've done, because most people won't. Most people will think they're there just to be a worker, and you're not there to be a worker. You're there to be, you're there to, well, you're there to be a worker, but you should also, be doing, everything you can to, you should, track your work. And most people don't do that. The people that do that, if you're able to do that for the firm, most people will not do that. And if you do that, then you're going to look like a much stronger person there than the people that don't. Okay, how can I tell if the feedback I'm getting is code for you? You're not like us. I'm in a niche practice group where I've delivered solid results, but keep getting comments about team synergy or soft skills, even though I've had no complaints from clients. Is this a sign that it might be better suited to a different type of firm or culture? And how do I position that in a job search? So if you get comments about team synergy or type, soft skills, that means probably that people don't feel like you're part of their team. And that could be and soft skills would also be, that you're not part of their team. It doesn't matter. Like when you're working for a firm, you have two types of clients. You have the clients you're working for, which are the external clients, and then you have the partners and other people that you're working for, which are the internal clients. And so, when you're an associate or you're a partner working for other people, like the people you're working for are your clients, and you need to treat them like your clients. You need to do everything you can to impress them, and you need to, make them think that you're on their side with everything, just like you would with a client. I mean, when you have a client, the client could be a murderer, but your job is to take their side, and you need to be able to do the same thing with the people that you're working for. So if they don't feel like you're getting along with them, if they don't feel like you're on their side and doing everything you can for them, then they're going to talk about team synergy. Now, there are situations that happen when you're working for a firm where you might not necessarily be, you may not fit in with the culture. They may be different type of people, and there's all sorts of different cultures and different types of people. I mean, like White and Case, for example, has a very solid culture. So does Latham. And a lot of firms have, cultures. And if you don't fit in with that culture, then you're not going to do well there because the people are different from you. So, you have two kind of things you can do in that situation. One is to make sure you start treating the people you're working for like clients. And then the other thing you need to do is, if the culture is just these are different types of people that you're uncomfortable with, I mean, you spend time with them and you just don't feel good about yourself. And it's just that energy that's coming off them. Then if you spend time with other types of people, like you feel comfortable with them. So you need to find a firm that matches your culture. One of the problems when most people do a job search is they just apply to jobs or a few places, and they're unable to find the right culture. And right culture can make a huge difference in your career. I'll tell you like one thing that's kind of an interesting story. I had a candidate once that he was a friend of mine, and he'd actually clerked for the judge. He was very conservative, and he was in San Francisco, and he'd lost the job with the firm. He'd been hired to do litigation and white collar work, and they didn't have enough white collar work, so they gave him litigation work, and he refused to do it. He's like, I came here to do white collar work, and so he got fired. And so he was looking for a job, and there was one firm in San Francisco that was all these conservative people, and he had, the Federal Society and all the stuff on his resume. So they loved him, and they made him an offer, and the offer wasn't as much as large law firms paid. And so he decided he'd be better off going to this major US law firm in New York, and went to work there and had a horrible experience and ended up quitting and being unemployed, being a contract attorney. And had he gone to the firm that paid less and matched culture, he probably would have, stayed employed. So, finding the right culture is very important, and working with people who, who you you connect with. And please ask more questions, and you can ask these questions, don't have to be about reviews, but talk to them as well. Okay, one thing that I'm struggling with is how to answer the inevitable question, why are you leaving your current firm? A question in interviews. And when the truth is I got a medical or a bad review. You mentioned honesty is important, but also warn against oversharing. How can I walk that line effectively, especially when I'm applying to firms in a similar market that might have connections with my current employer? Should I have a script prepared or tailored differently depending on the interviewer? Okay, so most of the time, almost all the time, when you're applying to a law firm that has connections with someone else, they're never going to talk to that other firm. They might ask for a reference, but most of the time, if it's a large firm in a market that you're doing that with, they're not going to. We'll call the firm and just confirm employment dates or something, but they're not going to call people and disturb your confidentiality. Law firms just don't do that. I mean, sometimes they do it in smaller markets, but they're not going to do that if you're interviewing, they're not going to ask you. But the why you're leaving your current firm is a good question. And it's something that comes up and you have to be able to answer it in the right way. The right answer is usually, and the best answer is something to do with the type of work you're doing. So, if you want to do more of one practice area and you're interviewing for something in that practice area, you say, I'm not getting enough work in this practice area. And I want to get more work in this practice area. So you might be doing real estate finance, and then you say, in your interview for real estate finance firm, you might say, I want to work in a firm where I can concentrate more on real estate finance. If you're interviewing a real estate finance firm, if you're a real estate finance attorney, and you're interviewing with a firm that does all different types of real estate transactional law, then you would say, I want to work in a firm that does more of this type of work. So typically, when you talk about leaving your firm, the best way to phrase it is something about the work. You can say, I want to work with larger clients, for example. Or if you're interviewing a firm with smaller clients, you say, I want to work with smaller clients. So you can talk about those sorts of things. So typically, talking about work is the most important thing because law firms want to hire people that want to specialize in different types of things. And so that can be, a very good way of approaching things. The other thing can be that's important that you can often mention is you can say that the firm doesn't have enough work. So if they don't have enough work where you're working, and that's true, then, or sort of true, then you can share that as well. In general, though, when a law firm's interviewing you, any law firm, they want to feel that this is a really good fit for you and you're moving up in some way, like you're moving more into the right practice area, moving more to work on the type of clients you work for. You have to be able to position your interviews in a way where it looks like that firm is a perfect match for you for some reason. You typically, when you go into interviews, you don't want to talk about anything that makes you look weak. So one of the ways that attorneys evaluate each other is if that attorney, starts talking negatively about themselves or saying that they made mistakes, then they look weak. There's a very kind of important theme that runs through the legal profession. When you're representing a client, you're supposed to take that client's side and not say anything negative about them. And that's just kind of the way lawyers are. You have to, if you say anything negative about your client, you're a bad attorney. So they want to make sure that you're saying, that you're always saying positive things about your clients, but you also need to do the same thing when you're looking for a job. If you start talking about, things that seem like they're negative to you or negative, then that's going to make you look weak. And you can't do that in interviews, and you can't also do that with clients. I was working with a partner once in a law firm and a big, the Dewey Valentine, and we had a client and he was saying all these negative things about the client. And even though that client was the one that was giving him business, and he ended up, not having enough business, leaving that firm and becoming a solo practitioner, which is just crazy when you've been a partner at a big law firm. But he wasn't someone that took the side of his client. So when you're interviewing, you always need to position yourself in a positive way. You can't say something about a negative review. What you can say sometimes is if the culture of the firm that you're interviewing with is much different than where you're working with, you just can say something like, the culture doesn't, match what I want. This is more of the type of culture that I want. And then you can try to identify with people. So those are some of the things, but you can never talk about getting a bad review. You can talk about not enough work in the practice area. I hope that helps because I do this all the time with people, and this is how I train people to go into interviews, is to make sure that they're doing that. And I think everybody realizes and knows, it's very well known, that when you go into a review, you never want to say anything negative about the employer. But you can talk about the culture, but you can't, you can't talk negatively about the person, about your employer, because if you do that, then the employer is going to think that you're going to do the same thing with them at one day. And people that talk negatively about their employer, you should never do that, because these are the people that are giving you, money and helping you. So kind of take that in mind. Okay, for performance reviews related to unrealistic expectations in a slow practice group, how do I frame that experience in interviews? I want to be honest, but I'm worried that even hinting at a negative review might damage my chances with other firms. Is there a way to reframe underperformance in the context without misleading employers? Okay, so that's a good point. You're in a practice area that's slow, and then there's unrealistic billing expectations. So one of the things that happens at all law firms, give me a second. Sorry about that. So yeah, so if you're in a slow practice group and there's unrealistic expectations, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So anytime you're in a law firm and things are slow, you have to understand, are things slow for certain people? Are they is it slow for everyone, or is it slow just for you? So when you get laid off from a firm, typically it becomes very hard to get a job, because the idea, typically might be that, either there was some issues with you, like your personality and things, or you weren't getting enough work. So if a practice area is slow, there's usually going to be people that are getting enough work and people that aren't getting enough work. So you have to always position yourself as someone that's getting enough. You always have to try to be, even in the slow practice group, you have to be doing everything you can to get work from different people. And that's part of your job as an attorney, is to always stay busy. So if you're not getting work, are there people that are getting work? And, and what does that mean? Why are they doing that? So you always need to kind of learn that. But if the work is slow, there's nothing wrong with saying that in a interview. You can just say there's not enough work. That's a very good reason, especially for associates, to look for a job. If there's not enough work, that's actually a good thing to say. It doesn't mean you're underperforming. It means maybe that you're not getting enough work from the right people. But if you get a negative review, because you're not doing enough work, you just tell firms when you're interviewing that that's the reason, that there's not enough work. And you always need to do like a broad job search when these things happen. You want to make sure, that you're applying to a lot of places, and you should always be kind of looking for a job. If your work gets slow at a firm and there's not enough work, you should be aggressively looking for a job, because firms will lay people off if there's not enough work. And they will often, if you've gotten a negative review at a firm where there's not enough work, they're giving you a negative review because they don't have enough work often. They're not telling you, that they're basically trying to get you to leave because they don't have enough work sometimes. So firms that have a lot of work will often not give negative reviews because they don't want people to leave, but if they don't have a lot of work, will often give negative reviews. Okay, how should I interpret vague or non-specific, feedback, like needs more initiative or could improve responsiveness if no examples are provided? So should I proactively address this in my interviews, or is that more likely to make me seem defensive or insecure? So needs more initiative means that you need to be doing things to try to get more work often, or you need to, you need to figure out kind of what that means. Or could improve responsiveness means, responding to emails, doing work quickly, and that sort of thing. But if no examples are provided, yes, you should ask for people to address that. And it's not going to make you feel defensive or insecure. It's going to be, trying to figure out like what you can do better. And there's nothing wrong with asking, with that. But, initiative, you have to, what does initiative mean? You need to understand that. You can look it up, if people say that to you. This is kind of interesting. I'll do something here that's kind of fun. I'll just show you, what I would do. This is kind of a fun thing here. I'll just show you. You see. And this is just something that I would, recommend doing. This is just kind of fun. I'll just show you what does. Second, I'm going to share my screen. This is kind of what I would do. Like when you kind of get these vague things, what you could say to ChatGPT, like, this is kind of crazy. What is needs or initiative mean in the context and the term implied. You literally can ask ChatGPT a question like this, to try to get some understanding. In the context, it can mean several things. Not taking ownership. Okay, wait now. Oh, right. Waiting for assignments, not being hungry for work. This is actually very good. Visibility and responsiveness, failure to anticipate needs, lack of drive, minimal engagement, being passive. Yeah, these are all, very good feedback. So this is what it would mean. Often, seeking assignments out. It means showing hunger, like, hungry for work, being visible. And that actually is a very important thing. I saw an associate in a big firm in Charlotte who was a real estate associate. And that's exactly what they said to him. They said, he wasn't hungry for work or, visibility. He wasn't, volunteering to do things. He wasn't showing like to help. So all these sorts of things, you can literally, go into ChatGPT and answer, that question, which is, it's very interesting how ChatGPT can, tell you that stuff. And, and then what was the other one? Could improve responsiveness, just doing this for you. And, so sometimes, if you don't understand what something means, you can add what does, this mean in the performance. And actually, ChatGPT is probably doing a better job of answering this than I could. It's not applying, acting quickly enough, slow to respond, all these sorts of things. So these are all things that are important for attorneys, dropping off the radar, not available after hours, all that sort of stuff. So these are, all good answers. I would just, when you get something like that, I would enter it. This is telling you exactly what attorneys should be doing, and when you answer those questions. So, just take this stuff and take it seriously. I would print this up and just say, these are things that I need to do. It's very interesting that, you can address, you can get these kind of answers from ChatGPT. They're actually better probably than I would give you, so give me 1 second here. No, give me 1 second. Sorry. That's very interesting. I think when you can go into ChatGPT and get answers to those questions. So, I like that answer. Actually, that was pretty good. Okay, so I believe my compensation was unfairly based on inaccurate reviews. Should I bring this up during exit interviews? Let me see here. Should I bring this up during exit interviews or when networking for a new opportunity? Could this hurt my chances of getting a strong reference, or is there a professional way to clarify my story, my side of the story when needed? So no, people aren't going to give you, I guess, so my compensation was unfairly reduced based on an inaccurate review. Typically, if a law firm is unfairly reducing your compensation, then, that's a good reason to leave, if you believe that. Or you can take whatever they said in the review seriously and improve. Sometimes people will say interviews or reviews inaccurate, and it may be inaccurate. It may be inaccurate because the firm doesn't have the work. If they're reducing your compensation, it means that they may not have the money. All sorts of things can happen. But if you're networking for a new opportunity, you can often just tell other firms that they can pay a lot more. The compensation, was low, and I want to make more money. There's nothing wrong with that. And, you don't necessarily need to clarify your side of the story. So, people typically will not check references. And if they do check references, they're not going to take them very seriously. And sometimes the only firms that I've seen really check references have been smaller firms, particularly like solo practitioners, like they think it's important. But most firms will not check your references. I had a woman, it was just crazy. She was at a large New York law firm, and like 6 months in or like 9 months in, she had some sort of psychotic break. I don't know what it was. She was like manic or something, and literally went crazy in the firm. And she told me, she'd just done some crazy things. She'd just been in this very manic state. And so, she left her job. I think she quit. The law firm didn't fire her. And she told me all this. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to call up the people that would be her references. And she was unemployed and she'd gotten help, and her psychology was okay. And she was like an outstanding attorney. She'd gone to, incredible law school, and done really well, and I had a good summer associate role. And so I checked her references, and it was a big New York firm, and everyone just gave her great references. Like, yeah, she's great. And that showed me that, most large law firms will not give you bad references. It's just how they work. It's just kind of the code in the legal profession. Lawyers often will not talk negatively about other lawyers. It only happens typically in smaller markets where I've seen that happen a lot, or with very small firms. So in an exit interview, you should never say anything negative about your employer and why you're leaving. You should be, as positive as possible. If you do say something about compensation in your exit interview, that's probably okay too. You can say, I think my compensation was unfairly reduced, but you should never quit a job because something like that happens. You should always find a new job first. And in an exit interview, if you want to be honest, that's fine. It's not going to hurt your chances of getting, a new position. They're not usually going to check your references. Okay, let's see. And these are good questions. Thank you, everyone that's asking them. I don't have a lot more questions after this one. I think I have one more or two more. So if you have any questions you can think of, please ask them. Okay, after working for several law firms and getting let go to most of them for poor billables as a result of anxiety due to pressure to produce some partners I work for, I have worked as a document review attorney for several years after leaving private law. What can I do for potential jobs going forward? Okay, so this happens to a lot of attorneys. A lot of attorneys either get let go or they quit jobs and then they put themselves in positions where there's not as much pressure. And there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes the practice of law, like doing that kind of work, is not for everyone. And they, it's just not what they're happy doing. And so they do other things. I knew a guy that was just brilliant. He got like almost a perfect score on the LSATs, and he went to UCLA Law School, which is very hard to get into. It's a great law school. He went to UCLA and did really, really well there. And then, he worked for a firm one summer and he's like, this is not something I want to do. And he became a document review attorney. And it's very funny. Like he saved all his money. He lived like in he shared a room in a house. So he didn't have low rent, and he ended up retiring with enough money to retire when he was like 45, which is kind of funny. But he's not practicing law anymore, and he has enough money, but to live, inexpensively. So, so when you're, it doesn't mean because you're working as a document review attorney, there's anything wrong with that. It may not. It just may be a position that doesn't have the kind of stress that you want. But one thing I would say is, you can often find a firm where you don't have to work a lot of hours, and you could have done that, or you could have, learned how to put yourself in an environment where you were more comfortable with the people that you're working for, and may not have had as high of expectations for the quality of work, or the work billing, the hours may have been different. But if you have worked at a document review attorney for several years, then you want to go back to the practice of law, you can find jobs, but you have to probably apply to smaller places that don't have a lot of people applying to them. And what does that mean? Typically the best way to find positions, this is just my advice. The best way to find positions is often let me just go here, share the screen again, to try to find, small firms. So if you're in, I don't know what firm, city you might be in, but let's say you're in Chicago. So you could say, Chicago, even personal injury attorneys. Like you go into a practice area where people aren't getting a lot of applications. And, so you go here and you search and you're going to find all of these like small firms, and you can do document review, you can do personal injury, you'll find all these firms. I mean, there's just going to be pages and pages of them. And you can see here like all of these different personal injury attorneys you could potentially apply to. And there's going to be, hundreds of them. And so that's what I would do is I would pick a practice area like personal injury or something, and apply to as many places as you could if you want to get back and practice law. I'm not saying personal injury has to be it. It could be, insurance defense. It could be, whatever. I mean, but something where people aren't getting a lot of, a lot of applications. So, and I'm just telling you that, if you were to apply to top dog personal injury attorneys, you're going to see that there's not a lot of, this is one guy. So maybe he needs help and is willing to train you. And a lot of people haven't applied to him. And look at this guy. He says, I've always excelled at what I'm doing. I see myself as somebody who can go to college and crush it in my career. And he said, what almost ruined my life was an addiction to painkillers from the age of 17 to 25, my junior year. So this guy, look at this. This is just absolutely crazy. I've never seen a law firm website like this. I'm going to actually save this. This is amazing. But he's talking about how he had an addiction, and he's considered cool and edgy because he of his drugs, and his girlfriend broke up with him before. Yeah, this is just absolutely amazing. But this guy's probably not getting a lot of people applying to him. So you can find lots of firms like this and get a job, doing whatever you want. Just say, hey, I want to go back and practice the law. You pick a practice area like that. So I hope that advice helps. I mean, it's something that most people don't do. But regardless of your situation, if you've been a document review attorney or whatever, you can find someone to hire you, but you're going to need to apply to smaller places and not, larger places. Okay, thank you, AJ, for asking another question. Let's see here. Again, if you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't answer this question. Okay, I've got one more question. Okay, comment, not necessarily a question. In government, they will rewrite you just to justify their own existence. Let me see here. They will rewrite, regardless of whether the revision. Let's say there may be 4 levels of review and 4 successive rewritings again because of bureaucrat that needs to justify a paycheck. Yeah, it's very funny. Like in government jobs, often that it's very bureaucratic in terms of how things happen and decisions are made. So that's a good question. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being on this webinar. I kind of did this a little bit differently today without the slides, but I wanted to hopefully tell people stories that they get identified from my own experience, and I hope that helps. And I think this was a good webinar. I mean, if you learned some of these messages that I've talked to you about, I mean, people like that are on these webinars, I hear from people every week. It's changed the direction of your career. And learning what you did today about reviews, why reviews are positive, why they're negative, how to get work, the right culture and everything can really change the direction of your life and what happens to you. Just finding a firm with the right culture can change your life. I mean, learning from performance reviews and fixing your, what you did could change your life. Learning how to work for people and get work can change your life. I mean, all these things can change your life. And, fixing, not being on the side of people that are negative about your firm can change your life and career. So I hope everyone learned a lot today. And normally I would go through power slides and just show you, different things and stuff, but I thought today would be helpful just to kind of, show you the kind of what the practice of law is about and how to do well. So thanks everyone. I will see everyone next week, and thank you for being here, and I hope that it helped you a lot.